This is the trifecta of self-defense education. I believe these three books are essential for anyone who is serious about self-defense and serious about teaching self-defense. Hi everyone, Steve Scott here, and this is going to be a video on a book review, but not so much a review as it is a recommendation of three very essential books on the subject of self-defense. And like I said, I'm not a very good book reviewer, but I can give you some recommendations here, and that's what I'm going to be doing here, because there are a lot of good books out on the market on self-defense, a lot of good videos on self-defense that deal with the nitty-gritty, the specifics of doing this or that in a specific situation, whatever it may be. But you need a general guide. What you need is a basic philosophical start to look at self-defense. And these three books provide that. So there are three things that really have guided me through my entire almost life when it comes to the subject of self-defense. The recommendation of these three books are based on these three principles that right now, and then everything else flows from this. So the number one principle that is guiding to me in self-defense is a quote by the British philosopher and essayist John Dryden. Lived many years ago, but he's quoted as saying, "Self-defense is nature's eldest law." And that's true. Our basic primal instinct is to defend ourselves and our loved ones and our possessions. It is nature's eldest law. So that's number one. That's the number one thing that focuses me on talking about self-defense. Number two is a quote from the gunfighter and marshal of the Old West, Bat Masterson. And many years ago, during the period of dime novels, when they wrote about these sensational gunfighters out west, the Easterners, as they were, would write about these and sell dime novels and Pulp Fiction type things. And a writer one time asked Bat Masterson, who really legitimately was a tough gunfighter, he really was. He said, well, this writer asked Masterson, what is it that makes you a better gunfighter than the other guys? What's the difference? What is it, And Masterson is quoted as saying, quote, it's not the faster or the more accurate. It's the one more willing. And what he meant by that was the one more willing to kill the other guy, to do what he needed to do to win that encounter, that fight. And that's the second thing that's guiding in my principles of self-defense. Are you more willing? Are you willing to do what's necessary to defend yourself? Okay, that's the second principle. And the third one was told to me by my father. I'm sure you've heard similar advice from other people. He didn't make it up, but it's what he told me as a young boy when I was learning how to defend myself. He said, quote, "There's no such thing as a fair fight." Lyle Scott. And that's my father. He gave me that great information, and that's true. There's no such thing, especially in self-defense, there's no such thing as a fair fight. So self-defense is nature's eldest law. It's not the faster or more accurate, it's the one more willing, and there's no such thing as a fair fight. So based on those three, that premise, that philosophical premise there, based on those three principles, I'm going to start talking about my recommendations for three excellent books that I think every self-defense instructor should own. The first book I want to recommend and give a really not very good review, but more of a recommendation, is by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. And the book is On Killing. Now, if you're in the military or you are a member of the law enforcement community, you've probably read this book and studied this book. It is an essentially important book for anyone who is teaching self-defense. And again, these recommendations aren't based on how to do this or how to do that. These recommendations are based on philosophical underpinnings of teaching self-defense. And here is one I think I know every instructor who teaches self-defense should study this book. And Colonel Grossman is a psychologist, and he's also studied, or he's taught at the U.S. Military Academy. He's very knowledgeable in this, and he's done an extensive amount of research on this subject, on killing people. So you'll say, well, I want to teach somebody how to defend themselves. I'm not necessarily teaching them how to kill somebody other human being. Remember what we talked about, what Pat Masterson said, the one more willing. You have to be willing to do what is necessary to defend yourself, your loved ones, your property, whatever it may be that is worth fighting over. And again, we talked about self-defense is nature's eldest law, and there's no such thing as a fair fight. So that's covered in this book. What it is, Colonel Grossman covers extensively the psychological, the moral, the ethical, the physical, the mental state of killing, taking the life of another human being. He really, really does a wonderful job in this. So this is why we as self-defense instructors, even though I'm not in the military and I'm not a member of the law enforcement, but if I'm going to teach self-defense to people, I have to take a really serious, sober look at it. And this is the first start. This is the first start. Let me just read off a few of the chapters that are in this book to give you a sense of what Colonel Grossman talks about. I'm not going to read all of them, but killing and combat trauma, the role of killing in psychiatric casualties. And he talks about, the reign of fear, the mud and guilt and horror of war, the burden of killing. So he talks extensively about that. Killing in physical distance. Right? Colonel Grossman talks about it's easier to kill someone at a distance, like, sending a guided missile over to another city to kill people, as opposed to up close and personal, that you see the other person's eyes when you kill them. These are things that play into killing. Talks about the anatomy of killing and atrocities. About atrocities. No honor here in killing anyone. They're just atrocities. There's no virtue in killing in these situations. If there were virtue in killing, but he discusses that as well. The killing response stages. What does it feel like to kill? He talks about this. Does a study of killing in Vietnam. What have we done to our soldiers? Killing in America. What are we doing to our children? He cites a lot of studies and a lot of research that he's done himself and others as well. So if you want a good basic primer on studying self-defense, teaching self-defense, this is a sobering, honest book on a very sobering and honest and very, very serious subject, and that's killing other human beings. So again, this is a good book to start with. I highly recommend it. I think is the essential book to start with if you are a self-defense instructor or a serious person about self-defense. This really will make you examine yourself and make you study your motives on why you're even teaching self-defense and what you're wanting to do when you teach other people how to fight, or how not to fight. But here we go, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman on killing. I highly recommend it. Meditations in Violence by Sergeant Rory Miller, to me, is an essential book. And anyone who teaches self-defense or is seriously interested in self-defense should read Sergeant Miller's wonderful book on Meditations on Violence. Well, let's get into the nitty-gritty of it and I'm going to convince you why you should buy this book and read it. If you haven't already, a lot of people have. It's a bestseller. But if you haven't already read it, let's talk about what it is. In it, I'm going to read here a bit. He writes at the end of his introduction, the format of this book. This book is divided into chapters. The first section, introduction, gives a brief overview of what the book is about, who I am, why I wrote it. And you've already read it or skipped over it, fair enough. That's the way he writes. I love the way he writes. Chapter 1, The Matrix. In an attempt to clear up language of violence, it addresses the many types of violence, especially how different they can be and how the lessons from one type do not apply to the needs of another. Chapter 2, How to Think, addresses assumptions about violence, about training, and introduces training for strategy and tactics. Chapter 3, Violence, talks about violence, describes the dynamics of violence. It is focused on criminal violence, how it happens, and what it is like. It will also cover the effects of adrenaline and stress hormones that accompany a sudden attack and how to deal with them. Chapter 4, Predators, it's about criminals and who they are, how they think, and how they act. what you can expect from them, and what knowledge is not important in a moment of crisis. Chapter 5, training. We'll give advice and drills to help adapt your training into the realities of violence. Chapter 6, making physical defense work, is about physical response to violence, not about effective technique, but about what makes a technique effective. That's a key thing in this book. Chapter 7, the last one, after, discusses the after effects of violence, what to expect, and how to deal with the psychological effects of either surviving a sudden assault or long-term exposure to violent environments. And this book is great. He really covers a lot of material, and he cites over and over again, you've got to focus on reality. It isn't what you want it to be, it is what it is. So Meditations on Violence is the one I would highly recommend to read after you've read On Killing. That gets you going in the right direction. And then Sergeant Miller's book, Meditations on Violence, is the second book I highly recommend. And if you have only one book to buy that you will ever buy on self-defense, buy this. It doesn't tell you how to do this or that. It doesn't talk about what techniques to use. It talks about how to use techniques effectively. This is the book to buy, number one. The third book on my list is Facing Violence by Sergeant Rory Miller. And again, just like his first book that I just reviewed, Meditations on Violence, this is a must-read. It really is. If you're teaching self-defense or you're serious about self-defense training, what Sergeant Miller talks about in Facing Violence, it expands on his first book. He really got you going in that first book. Now he really gets you reeled in, and he talks a lot of specifics in training. And again, it's humbling, common sense, just down-to-earth information that all of us who teach self-defense or are serious about self-defense really need to think about and study. So let me get into the book real quickly. Again, as I've said before, if you want to get an idea what the instructor, a very good idea what the writer is talking about, read the introduction first. Okay, and as an author, that's why I write an introduction, so I can introduce the book to you and tell you why and how I'm writing it, and some key points I want you to glean from the book. Well, Sergeant Miller, in this case, does another great job in his introduction. Let's get right into it, and I'll give you the tone and kind of the nitty-gritty of what the book's about. Okay, and he talks about this. There are 7 elements that must be addressed to bring self-defense training to something approaching complete. Any training that dismisses any of these areas leaves the student vulnerable. And he goes on, he does this the whole book. He really gets down to it, and he gives you specific things. And so, number 1, legal and ethical implications. Now, he goes into great detail on talking about your legal responsibilities, what happens, the ethical responsibilities that you have. He looks at it from a moral, religious standpoint, from an ethical standpoint of all phases. But, you know, like what he talks about here and what I've heard many other self-defense instructors say is that one thing you can be sure of in any self-defense situation, a real adult encounter of violence, of dealing with violence, is you're going to have to deal with the legal system. You're going to have to deal with the criminal courts, and you're going to have to deal with the civil litigation. And you're going to have to deal with yourself, too, and others. You know, the effects that this violent act you did, or that you had to do, or maybe didn't do, how it will affect others as well. So, number 1, the legal and ethical implications. He really goes into detail. I can't do them justice talking about it. You got to read it for yourself. The next phase, violence dynamics. Self-defense must teach how the attacks happen. Knife defense is worthless unless it centers on how knives are actually used by predators. You get the idea. He talks about focus the dynamics, the dynamics of a real fight, what really goes on. He lays it out. He lays it out very well, so I highly recommend it. In that chapter, by the way, he talks about an interesting thing that he calls a monkey dance. Now, years ago, back in the early 80s, I heard the phrase, flare your lats. And I heard that from John Saylor, and I've used it many times myself. And in my own background of working in some very dangerous situations when I was working in the inner city in my line of public recreation. I wasn't in law enforcement, but I certainly was in public recreation, and I dealt with some wonderful people, but I also dealt with some people who weren't so wonderful. One thing I noticed that Sergeant Miller points out in his book brilliantly is what he calls the monkey dance. Again, John Saylor and I call it flaring your lats. And what happens is the defensive posture, the actions, young men, sometimes young women, but certainly young men of any species, not just humans. You talk about any other species on Earth, the actions they take to really scare away the opponents, scare away their adversary, their assailant, scare away their enemy. The actions they take to try not to fight and to bluff their way out of it and to look tough. And sometimes they have every intention to fight, but there's always a body tell, and it's what John Saylor and I call flaring your lats, what Sergeant Miller calls the monkey dance. By the way, in the first book I reviewed on killing, Colonel Grossman talks about that very same subject. So it's a very interesting subject. So violence dynamics, it's one of the many things that Sergeant Miller talks about. Then he goes in avoidance. Students need to learn and practice not fighting, escape and evasion, and he goes on extensively in this area here. So avoidance. Counter ambush is the next phase. If the student doesn't see the precursors or can't successfully avoid the counter, if he doesn't read what's happening, he's going to get in trouble. So he talks about how to read those precursors, those pre-fight, those pre-violent activities, the pre-violence tell, what it shows you. Like a poker player, everybody has a tell. You can kind of see what their face or whatever. Every fight has the same thing. It has a lead up to it. If you know how to read it, keep you out of trouble. That's the counter ambush. Next one is breaking the freeze. Freezing is almost universal in a sudden attack. Students must learn to recognize a freeze and how to break out of one. And he talks about that. He talks about the physical, the mental, emotional freeze that happens. So he talks about that quite well. Then he discusses the fight itself. Most martial arts and self-defense instructors concentrate their time right here. This is the area people talk about mainly. What is taught just needs to be in line with how violence happens in the world. Again, he pulls you back in. It's humbling. It makes you think about, let's be pragmatic, let's be functional, let's be realistic in what we teach in our self-defense, what we practice in our self-defense. It's not a kung fu movie. It's a real fight. It's a real violent encounter one has to deal with. And finally, he talks about the aftermath. There are potential legal, psychological, and medical effects of engaging in violence, no matter how justified, and advanced preparation is critical. That gives you an idea what this book's about. And again, as a third book, coming off Meditations on Violence and coming off on killing, this is the trifecta of self-defense education. I believe these three books are essential for anyone who is serious about self-defense and serious about teaching self-defense. Now, everybody there, as well as I do, there are a lot of good books and some not so good books or videos or DVDs or whatever it may be on the subject of self-defense. It's a big market. And we got to be real. We got to be realistic about when we teach self-defense to others and how we approach it in our own lives. These three books provide that. I highly recommend them. And if you are going to teach, you've got to have a start. You've got to have your foundation. These three books provide that foundation. Everything else you can build off of it. So these are three books I think every self-defense instructor, every serious self-defense student should have and keep and study on a regular basis.